The 73-year-old veteran had spent most of his life following orders, keeping his head down and doing what was expected. He had seen parts of the world most people could only read about in books. He had faced danger, loss, and exhaustion, and when he finally returned home, he wanted nothing more than peace. His old neighborhood had been fine for a while, but over the years it had changed. Rules multiplied, restrictions tightened, and nosy neighbors had become part of daily life. Every small action was monitored. There were complaints about hedges being too tall, paint colors too bright, or cars parked in the wrong spot. He had reached a point where even opening a window without asking for approval seemed impossible. One morning, he woke up feeling that familiar tightness in his chest when he looked out of the window at the neat rows of identical houses, manicured lawns, and the same old rules he had to follow. He realized he could not live this way anymore. He wanted space, freedom, and a place where he could finally breathe. It was time to move somewhere he could make his own rules, or at least live without people constantly questioning him. He began looking for property outside the town, outside the reach of any homeowners association, anywhere he could own land without constant interference. After a few weeks, he found a farm just beyond the town's limits. It was beautiful. Wide open fields stretched for miles, dotted with trees. A small pond reflected the sky, and a worn barn stood waiting to be repaired. It was not perfect, but it had potential, and most importantly, it was his chance at freedom.
He made the decision quickly, closing the sale within days.
The farm would be his sanctuary, a place where he could live life on his own terms. From the moment he stepped onto the property, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The smell of earth, the sound of birds, and the gentle sway of trees made him feel alive again. He began planning what he wanted to do. He would repair the barn to store equipment, plant a vegetable garden, raise a few chickens, and maybe even get a small goat or two. The work would be hard, but it would be satisfying. It would be work he chose to do for himself, not because someone was watching. He spent his first few days clearing parts of the land. Fallen branches were gathered, old fences were repaired, and the overgrown garden areas were cleaned out. Each small accomplishment brought him a sense of pride. He remembered how in the military, he had felt that same satisfaction after completing a mission. Only now it was peaceful and personal. He could finally feel in control of his surroundings, making choices that benefited him without worrying about complaints or fines. However, word traveled fast in small towns, even about a property that technically didn't fall under anyone's control. A local woman, infamous for her overbearing nature and obsession with rules, heard about the new farm. She had made a reputation for herself by always pointing out violations, complaining to authorities, and involving herself in every minor disagreement. People had nicknamed her Karen, and the nickname seemed to follow her everywhere. The veteran had heard stories about her before moving, but he had hoped that living outside the HOA limits would keep him out of her reach. He was wrong. Within days of moving in, Karen appeared on his property. She did not come quietly or politely. She stormed onto the land, waving papers and yelling at him that everything he was doing was illegal. Her voice echoed across the fields, startling the birds and making the veteran pause in his work. He looked at her calmly, trying to understand what she meant. She was pointing at the barn, the garden, and even the old pond as if every part of his property violated some unwritten rule. The veteran tried to explain that the farm was outside her jurisdiction, that he owned the land legally, and that he had all the necessary permits. Karen was not interested in listening. She interrupted him constantly, raising her voice and making claims that sounded more like accusations than concerns. She was convinced that he could not possibly know the rules and that she needed to intervene for the good of the community. The veteran listened patiently, his military training helping him stay composed even as she grew louder. Neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some watched from a distance, curious to see how the situation would unfold. Others were sympathetic to Karen's persistence, assuming she had some legitimate concern. The veteran, however, refused to escalate the situation. He did not want conflict. He simply wanted to live in peace and continue restoring his property. Despite Karen's anger, he offered her a chance to see the paperwork proving his compliance, even suggesting a tour of the property to show her that nothing was illegal. Karen refused politely, of course, because her goal was not understanding but confrontation. The veteran spent the rest of the day repairing the barn, planting seeds, and clearing more brush. Karen's shouting could be heard in the background at times, but he chose to ignore it. The The quiet of the land, broken occasionally by her intrusion, reminded him why he had moved here. The satisfaction of physical work, combined with the knowledge that he was on solid legal ground, gave him a sense of peace. He thought back to his life in the military, the years of discipline and the challenges he had faced. This was a different kind of challenge, one that required patience rather than strength, diplomacy rather than orders. He was determined to meet it with the same steadiness he had always maintained. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, the veteran sat on the porch of the old farmhouse. He could see the garden rows he had planted, the repaired fence along the edge of the property, and the barn that now had a sense of purpose. The land looked peaceful, even though he knew that Karen would return. He thought about the kind of life he wanted to build here, not just for himself, but for anyone who might visit or rely on him in the future. He wanted this farm to be a place of calm, a place where neighbors could gather without fear, and where hard work was rewarded by the simple beauty of the land. Karen's intrusion had been unpleasant, but it also confirmed something important. The veteran had made the right choice by moving here. He was free to live on his own terms, and he had the knowledge and the patience to handle any challenge. He would not let someone else's obsession with rules and control dictate how he lived. Instead, he would continue building, repairing, planting, and living with the quiet dignity that had always guided him. The farm, with its wide open spaces and possibilities, was a place where he could finally breathe, think, and enjoy life the way he wanted. As darkness fell, he lit a small lantern and walked around the garden, inspecting the young plants he had nurtured. The air was cool and smelled of earth and growing things. He felt a sense of connection to the land that he hadn't felt anywhere else. Each step he took on the soft soil reminded him that he had chosen the right path. He knew challenges would come, including more confrontations with Karen, but he felt ready. For the first time in many years, he was living for himself, and that simple fact made every obstacle seem manageable. That night, as he sat on the porch and listened to the sounds of the farm settling for the evening, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would protect this land, nurture it, and build a life that was both meaningful and free. Karen's anger and intrusion were nothing compared to the peace and satisfaction he felt here. He would meet any challenge calmly, with patience and reason, just as he had faced the world before. The farm was not just a property, it was a new chapter in his life, a chapter that he intended to write with care, integrity, and freedom. And as he finally went to bed, the veteran felt a sense of hope he had not felt in decades, knowing that this was only the beginning of his new life. The veteran woke the next morning with the sun spilling through the windows of his farmhouse. The air smelled fresh and earthy, carrying a promise of a day full of work and small victories. He had expected Karen to return, and sure enough, as he stepped outside, he could see her in the distance, pacing near the edge of his property. Her voice carried across the fields, sharp and commanding, as she waved papers in her hand. But the veteran remained calm. He had a plan for how to handle her, and he knew losing his temper would only give her more power. He began the day repairing the fence around the vegetable garden. Each post he secured reminded him that he was protecting his space, his choices, and his peace. Karen's shouting continued in the background, but it became more like noise than a threat. Neighbors slowly started to appear, drawn by curiosity. Some came from nearby properties, watching quietly from behind trees or fences, unsure of what was happening. Others drove slowly down the dirt road, trying to see the conflict unfold. The veteran, noticing them, waved and smiled, showing that he had no intention of escalating matters. He wanted the community to see him as approachable and reasonable, not as someone to fear or provoke. Karen, however, seemed determined to make the day difficult. She began calling various local authorities, claiming that the veteran was violating zoning rules and building without permits. She even went to the post office, trying to find out if any official notices had been sent to the veteran. Her persistence was exhausting, but it also revealed something important to the veteran. Her anger was not based on facts. It was based on control. She could not tolerate someone living freely without her interference, and that was her weakness. Rather than confront her directly every time, the veteran decided to document everything. He took photographs of the property, the repairs he was making, and the work he had done on the garden and barn. He filed paperwork showing that all his permits were up to date and kept records of the land purchase. This careful preparation gave him confidence. He knew that if Karen tried to escalate her complaints legally, He could respond calmly and with evidence. This was a strategy he had learned during his years of service. Preparation and patience were stronger than anger. While Karen tried to stir conflict, the veteran focused on his own work. He repaired broken boards in the barn, swept away old debris, and began planting more vegetables in the garden. Each small task gave him satisfaction. He reflected on the years he had spent serving his country, and he realized that although those challenges were different, the lessons remained the same. Discipline, patience, and careful planning could overcome almost any obstacle. He had faced real danger in the military, and now his challenge was to maintain peace in the face of unnecessary harassment. Though it was different, it was just as important to approach it with calm and thoughtfulness. As the morning turned into afternoon, more neighbors began to gather. They had seen Karen's intrusion before and were curious about the veteran's response. Some asked questions politely, wanting to understand the situation. Others offered advice, but he politely declined, explaining that he had everything under control. The veteran made an effort to be friendly, sharing stories about his time in service and why he had decided to move here. People began to listen, and slowly opinions started to shift. Karen's claims began to lose credibility as neighbors saw the veteran's knowledge, patience, and genuine desire to live peacefully. Karen did not notice the change in perception. She continued to call authorities and shout across the fields. At one point, she even tried to measure the barn and point out that it did not meet some arbitrary code, ignoring the veteran's explanations. But her actions began to feel desperate rather than powerful. The veteran, calm as ever, allowed her to vent while continuing his work. When she left, exhausted from her shouting, he continued planting seedlings, repairing the fence, and organizing tools in the barn. Each step of progress reminded him that his life here was his own to shape. In the evening, he decided to walk around the property, checking on the plants and ensuring that the repairs were holding. He noticed how the sunlight reflected off the pond, making the water look like glass. Birds chirped and settled in the trees, seemingly undisturbed by the earlier commotion. It was a peaceful scene, and he felt gratitude for the life he was building. Karen's anger was a disturbance, but it could not take away the satisfaction he felt from his work, the beauty of the land, or the freedom he now enjoyed. He reflected on how his experience in the military had prepared him for situations like this. It was not about confrontation or aggression, but strategy, patience, and staying calm under pressure. Karen's attempts to intimidate him were simply a test, and he had passed it by remaining composed and focused on his goals. He also realized that living outside the HOA gave him a unique advantage. Karen had no official power here, only her voice and persistence, and he had the legal and moral clarity to stand his ground. Neighbors who had observed the day's events started approaching him cautiously. One woman asked about the garden, impressed with how well it was planned and maintained. Another man complimented the repairs on the barn, noting that the veteran's efforts were impressive for someone his age. The veteran smiled, shared tips, and even offered to let them help with future projects if they were interested. Slowly, a sense of community began to form, not centered on rules or complaints, but on shared interests, respect, and genuine human connection. Karen noticed this too, though she did not admit it. Her efforts to stir conflict were losing effect as neighbors began siding, at least in spirit, with the veteran. She tried to escalate, but her audience was shrinking. People were beginning to see her as someone who thrived on disruption rather than fairness. The veteran, meanwhile, continued his work, gaining support quietly through action rather than argument. As the day ended, the veteran prepared a simple meal and ate on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflected in the pond. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that despite the challenges, he was building a life of freedom, peace, and purpose. Karen's intrusion was nothing compared to the joy of planting his crops, repairing his barn, and experiencing the beauty of the land he now called home. Before going to bed, he wrote a short note to himself about the day, listing accomplishments and observations. He recorded Karen's actions, the neighbors who had interacted with him, and the progress he had made on the farm. This note was both a record and a reminder of his resilience. He knew that more challenges would come, but he also knew that he had the tools, patience, preparation, and calm to handle them. As he turned off the light, he felt a sense of contentment he had not experienced in decades. knowing that each day here brought him closer to the life he had always wanted and deserved. The following morning, the veteran woke to a cool breeze carrying the scent of damp earth from the previous night's rain. His muscles ached slightly from the work he had done on the farm over the past 2 days, but the aches felt good. They were the kind that reminded him he was alive, that he was building something with his own hands. Today, he knew Karen would return. She always did, and every day she came back with renewed energy and louder complaints. But he did not fear her anymore. He had found a rhythm in his life here, a sense of purpose, and a strategy to handle her disruptions. He started the morning by walking the perimeter of the property, checking for any damage that might have occurred overnight. The fence posts he had repaired seemed sturdy. The garden looked healthy and the barn held strong. He felt a small wave of satisfaction. The veteran was meticulous. He believed that small details mattered and that tending to them now would prevent larger problems later. Each repair, each seed planted, each cleared path on the farm was an investment in his peace of mind. Karen arrived mid-morning as he had expected, shouting before she was even within sight. She carried new papers this time, claiming they were official notices about zoning violations. The veteran waved at her calmly, setting down the tools he had been using. He could have reacted angrily, but decades of discipline had taught him that staying calm was always more effective. He walked toward her, hands empty, showing that he had nothing to hide. Karen launched into her complaints, gesturing at the barn, the vegetable rows, and even the pond. She spoke quickly, not giving him a chance to respond. The veteran listened patiently, nodding occasionally, letting her finish. When she finally paused to catch her breath, he calmly asked if she had checked the county records for the property. She looked flustered, but insisted that the documents she held were proof that he was in violation. The veteran smiled politely and explained that he had all the required permits, had followed the zoning rules, and was within his rights to maintain the farm as he pleased. Neighbors had begun to gather, sensing that today's encounter might be more intense than usual. Some stood behind trees, others leaned on fences, and a few approached cautiously to see what would happen. They watched as the veteran remained calm and collected, even as Karen's voice grew louder and more frantic. Slowly, the mood of the onlookers began to shift. It was becoming clear that Karen's anger was disproportionate, and that the veteran's approach was measured and fair. Karen, realizing she was losing her audience, tried a new tactic. She threatened to involve local media, claiming that illegal construction and unauthorized farming were taking place. The veteran nodded again, acknowledging her words without reacting negatively. He calmly offered to show anyone interested the documentation, proving his compliance with all laws and regulations. This gesture seemed to confuse her. She expected resistance, not openness. Meanwhile, neighbors who had been hesitant started asking polite questions about the farm and the work being done. The veteran explained everything simply, describing the repairs to the barn, the plans for crop rotation, and the sustainable methods he intended to use on the property. Karen began pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath, clearly frustrated that her intimidation tactics were not working. The veteran continued to focus on his tasks, fetching water for the garden, checking the young seedlings, and repairing a broken gate latch. Each time Karen attempted to shout or interrupt, he remained calm, showing her that he was unshakable. This patience was powerful. It became obvious that Karen's anger could not control him. Instead, it only highlighted the contrast between her chaos and his composed diligence. By afternoon, the veteran had decided to use the situation as an opportunity rather than a burden. He invited a few curious neighbors to walk the farm with him. They examined the barn, the vegetable garden, and the pond. He explained his methods for planting, how he maintained the soil, and even shared small tips from his military days that applied to organization and efficiency. The neighbors began to understand the dedication and care he put into every aspect of the farm. They asked questions and offered their own insights, turning a potential conflict into a moment of community learning. Even Karen was left standing off to the side, unable to command attention or sway opinions. Karen's attempts to discredit the veteran grew more erratic as the day progressed. She tried measuring the barn herself, waving her papers at neighbors and insisting that the veteran needed to stop all work immediately. But the veteran's calm explanation of the legal and practical aspects of his farm prevented her from gaining any traction. He spoke respectfully to her, treating her as a person, not an adversary, which only underscored her increasingly unreasonable behavior. Neighbors began to see her as someone obsessed with control rather than someone with a valid concern. As the day wore on, the veteran decided to focus on finishing the repairs in the barn. He replaced a sagging support beam, swept the floor, and organized tools in a neat, efficient manner. The barn, once a dilapidated structure, now looked usable and safe. He felt pride in his work, knowing that his effort was both practical and symbolic. This barn represented his independence, his ability to create a life on his own terms, and his refusal to be intimidated by unreasonable people. By late afternoon, some neighbors had joined him in small ways, helping carry boards or offering advice on planting techniques. This small collaboration created a sense of community that Karen could not disrupt. People were talking, laughing quietly, and learning from each other. The veteran's patience and dedication had turned a situation that could have been hostile into something positive. Even Karen's presence seemed less threatening, as it became clear that she could not control the narrative or the growing support for the veteran. The veteran took a moment to walk to the pond and inspect the water. The reflection of the sky shimmered on the surface, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a fish or a falling leaf. He felt calm. The farm was slowly taking shape, not just in physical terms but in the way the community perceived it. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he decided to leave the restrictive neighborhood behind. He had chosen a life where he could work, think, and live freely, and he was proving that patience and persistence could overcome unnecessary conflict. As evening approached, the veteran decided to host a small informal gathering. He invited neighbors to share a meal, explaining that it was a chance to get to know each other and to see the farm in a relaxed setting. People brought food, shared stories, and asked questions about his life in service and his plans for the property. The atmosphere was warm, cooperative, and respectful. Karen, noticing this, seemed frustrated. Her attempts to isolate him or create tension were failing. Instead, the veteran's calm demeanor and willingness to include others were building goodwill and trust. When the gathering ended, the veteran reflected on the day. Karen had come, shouted, and attempted to disrupt his life, but her efforts had failed to shake him or alienate the neighbors. Instead, his patience, preparation, and openness had turned a potentially negative situation into an opportunity for connection. He felt satisfied knowing that he could handle future confrontations with the same strategy. Remain calm, follow the law, and focus on the work that mattered. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, he felt a sense of quiet pride. The farm was no longer just land. It was a symbol of resilience, patience, and the power of calm action. He knew challenges would continue, but he was ready. With every repair, every seed planted, and every neighbor who began to understand and support him, he was building more than a farm. He was building a life that reflected his values and his freedom. Karen's interruptions were merely noise in the background, unable to overshadow the life he was creating or the sense of peace he had worked so hard to achieve. The next morning, the veteran woke early, greeted by the soft chirping of birds and the smell of wet soil from last night's rain. He had grown accustomed to the peace and solitude of the farm, yet he knew Karen was not done. Her persistence had become almost predictable, like a storm that appeared every few days. But the veteran had learned how to weather storms, whether they were literal or metaphorical. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, ready to start another day of work. He decided to begin by inspecting the barn. The repairs from the previous days had held up well, but he wanted to make sure everything was secure. The wooden beams were sturdy, the floorboards solid, and the tools neatly organized. He felt pride in the small victories he was achieving. Every nail hammered, every plank fixed, and every tool properly stored was a step toward building the life he wanted. This work was hard but fulfilling, and it reminded him of the importance of patience and diligence. Karen arrived earlier than usual that day, moving with purpose, holding papers and muttering to herself. She was clearly frustrated that her previous attempts to intimidate the veteran had failed. She shouted across the property, claiming new violations and insisting that he stop his work immediately. The veteran approached her calmly, hands raised slightly in a peaceful gesture. He asked her to explain her concerns clearly, and offered to show her any documentation she wanted. Karen hesitated, momentarily thrown off by his calm approach. She was used to confrontation, not understanding, and this made her uneasy. As neighbors began to appear, drawn by the commotion, the veteran decided to turn the situation into a lesson rather than a conflict. He invited them to walk the property with him, showing the repairs he had made to the barn and the progress in the garden. He explained his methods for planting, maintaining the soil, and organizing the farm efficiently. The neighbors listened attentively, asking questions and offering ideas. The veteran answered each question patiently, sharing insights from both his military experience and his new life on the farm. Karen, realizing that the neighbors were not reacting as she hoped, grew increasingly agitated. She attempted to interrupt, waving her papers and speaking over the veteran, but he continued calmly, allowing the community to see her behavior for what it was. His composure contrasted sharply with her erratic actions, and slowly the neighbors began to distance themselves from her, seeing that her claims were not based on reason, but on a desire for control. The veteran decided to focus on repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged by the rain. As he worked, he noticed a few neighbors approaching to help. One brought extra tools, another offered advice on how to secure the posts better, and a third volunteered to help carry materials. This collaboration created a sense of shared purpose and community. The veteran realized that by remaining calm and inviting others to participate, he was turning a potentially hostile situation into an opportunity for connection and learning. Karen, growing frustrated, attempted to call local authorities again, but by now the neighbors were familiar with the situation. Some even offered to speak on the veteran's behalf if needed, explaining that he had all the proper documentation and was acting within the law. Karen's power over the narrative was slipping, and she could sense it. The veteran, meanwhile, continued his work, repairing the fence, checking the garden, and organizing tools in the barn. Each task completed reinforced his confidence and sense of independence. By midday, the veteran had finished repairing the fence and decided to inspect the young plants in the garden. The seedlings were thriving, showing the results of his careful planning and attention. He watered them gently, speaking softly to himself about the importance of patience and consistency. Each small victory reminded him that progress was built one step at a time, and that even in the face of challenges, steady effort would yield results. Some neighbors stayed to help with the garden, learning techniques from the veteran and offering their own suggestions. This informal mentoring strengthened the sense of community around the farm. The veteran shared stories from his life, both from his military service and his experiences on the farm, creating connections that went beyond simple neighborly interest. People began to see him not just as a veteran or a new property owner, but as a source of knowledge, patience, and calm leadership. Karen, seeing that her influence was waning, tried one last attempt to disrupt the day. She shouted that the veteran was violating property codes and threatened to escalate the situation to higher authorities. The veteran, without anger or frustration, calmly explained that he had followed all regulations and offered to show her the official documents again. He spoke with respect and clarity, demonstrating that he had nothing to hide and that her threats held no power over him. This calm response further diminished her credibility in front of the neighbors. As afternoon turned into evening, the veteran decided to host a small gathering on the farm. He invited neighbors to share a meal and talk about the day's events. People brought food, shared stories, and discussed ideas for the farm. Karen was present, but her presence felt less threatening as the neighbors focused on the positive atmosphere and the sense of community being built. The veteran's patience and openness had transformed the farm into a space where learning, collaboration, and connection were possible, rather than conflict and tension. During the gathering, the veteran explained his plans for the future of the farm. He talked about planting additional crops, expanding the garden, and continuing to repair and improve the barn. He shared his vision of creating a place where neighbors could come together, learn from each other, and enjoy the simple pleasures of life on the farm. The community responded positively, offering support and ideas, reinforcing the sense that this farm was becoming a hub of positive energy and collaboration. As the sun set, casting warm colors across the fields, the veteran reflected on the day. Karen had come, tried to disrupt, and failed. Her attempts at intimidation had been neutralized by patience, preparation, and community support. The veteran felt a deep sense of satisfaction and pride in how he had handled the situation. He had not only protected his property, but had also strengthened relationships with neighbors and demonstrated the power of calm, reasoned action. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars and listening to the soft sounds of the farm settling for the evening, The veteran felt a profound sense of peace. The farm was no longer just a place to live. It was a symbol of resilience, community, and the ability to face challenges with patience and integrity. Karen's presence, once a source of stress, had become a reminder that calm, steady effort and respect for others could overcome conflict. The veteran went to bed with a sense of accomplishment, ready to continue building his life and his farm, knowing that he had not only survived the confrontation, but had turned it into a source of growth and connection.